They called him Il Silencio, the silence. Lorenzo Caruso was a king in an empire of shadows, a man who believed that everything and everyone had a price. In a world where promises shattered like glass and loyalty was measured in blood, Lorenzo built his throne on fear. To win a wager of power, he makes a ruthless offer to the most invisible woman in his house, his maid, Annie. A marriage of convenience. In exchange for her brother's life, she accepts, believing she's only sacrificing her own future for the family she loves. But what begins as a game of control turns into a war within his own soul, because behind Annie's quiet innocence lies a strength his walls cannot contain. As days pass, the silence between them grows louder than words, and when love rises from the darkness, Lorenzo faces the only enemy he never learned to fight, the truth. This is the story of a man who had everything: power, wealth, and fear, and a woman who had nothing, yet possessed the one thing he could never buy: the freedom to love. A ruthless mafia boss, Lorenzo Caruso, forces his maid, Annie, into a fake marriage to secure his power. What begins as a cold arrangement soon turns into a dangerous attraction. But a dark secret from the past threatens not only the fragile love growing between them, but also their very lives. In a world ruled by shadows and betrayal, Lorenzo must choose between his empire and the redemption that only she can offer. From which city or country are you diving into this story of power and passion? Tell us in the comments. We love knowing where our stories are reaching across the world. And if you enjoy tales filled with dark secrets, impossible love, and emotional twists, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single moment. Because in the end, every heart hides a secret, and every story holds a redemption. The silence in the Caruso mansion was a living thing. It had weight and texture, breathing in the vast, empty spaces between marble floors and vaulted ceilings. It was not the silence of peace, but of a predator at rest, watchful, heavy, and absolute. Annie felt it settle on her shoulders like a shroud as she worked, her hands moving in a steady, practiced rhythm across the gilded surface of a console table. She kept her eyes downcast. It was the first and most important rule she had taught herself in this house of shadows. To look was to be seen, and to be seen was to invite attention. Attention from the men with eyes like chips of ice who moved through the halls was a currency she could not afford to trade in. Her world was a small, focused circle of diligence, the scent of lemon oil and old wood, the soft rasp of her polishing cloth, the dull ache in her lower back. It was a world she could control. And in control, there was a sliver of safety. A sound. No. A shift in the atmosphere made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. The air grew colder, charged with a sudden, potent stillness. She didn't need to look up. She knew. Lorenzo Caruso stood in the arched doorway of the grand salon. Annie's fingers tightened on her cloth, the knuckles white beneath her skin. She forced herself to continue the circular motion, her muscles screaming in protest. She could feel his presence, a tangible force that seemed to suck the very warmth from the room. He was a statue carved from shadows and secrets, his impeccably tailored suit a dark armor against the world. His silence was the source of his power, the origin of his name in the city's underworld, Il Silencio. They said his enemies never heard him coming. They simply ceased to be, erased in the vacuum he left behind. He moved into the room. His Italian leather shoes made no more than a whisper against the Persian rug, a sound so faint it was more felt than heard. Annie could feel his gaze sweep across the room, a cold, indifferent assessment of his domain. She knew it passed over her without registering her as a person. She was merely a part of the scenery, a functioning component of the grand, silent machine of his household. It's better this way, she told herself, the thought a desperate prayer. It's safer to be invisible. The lie was thin, but it was all she had. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Every second he was in the room was a tightrope walk over a canyon. She held her breath, waiting for him to leave, for the air to thin, for the crushing weight of his presence to lift. He stopped beside a large mahogany desk, his back to her. He picked up a small silver letter opener, turning it over in his long, graceful fingers. The dim light caught the glint of his signet ring. For a timeless moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to the space of that room, to the silent man and the invisible girl. Then, as quietly as he had entered, he placed the letter opener back in its exact spot and was gone. Annie didn't exhale until the oppressive silence had returned to its normal, predatory hum. She closed her eyes, her forehead resting against the cool wood of the table. A tremor ran through her hands. One day at a time. That's how she would survive this place. For Leo. The image of her younger brother, his face pale against a hospital pillow, his breathing shallow, flashed behind her eyelids. He was her anchor and her wound, the reason she polished the furniture of monsters and prayed for invisibility. Later that night, the air in the private back room of Il Sardo restaurant was thick with cigar smoke and the low rumble of men who believed they owned the world. The clink of ice in heavy crystal glasses was the only sharp sound in the otherwise muted atmosphere of expensive whiskey and quiet menace. Lorenzo sat at the head of the table, a portrait of lethal stillness. He nursed his drink, the amber liquid untouched, his dark eyes watching the man across from him. Rico Santoro laughed, a sound like gravel churning in a cement mixer. He was a big man, expansive in his gestures, all flashy rings and a booming voice that filled the space Lorenzo's silence left empty. "You have to admit, Lorenzo, the old ways are dying," Rico said, leaning forward, his bulk straining the buttons of his silk shirt. "Fear is a currency with diminishing returns. Loyalty, true loyalty, that is the future. And it's something you cannot buy." Lorenzo's expression remained unreadable. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey, the burn in his throat a familiar comfort. He knew this game. Rico was a dog, barking to test the strength of the chain. "Loyalty," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that cut through the smoke, "is a byproduct of strength. The weak do not inspire it." Rico grinned, showing a gold tooth. "Strength? Or terror? Your father ruled with an iron fist, yes, but even he understood the value of a personal touch. He could inspire devotion. You, Il Silencio, you inspire obedience. A man obeys because he must. He is devoted because he wants to be. Tell me, is there anyone in your world who isn't paid or terrified into submission?" The challenge hung in the air, sharp and glittering. It was a direct assault on his reign, his character, his very name. Lorenzo felt the coils of cold fury tighten in his gut, but his face remained a mask of stone. "I will make you a wager," Rico continued, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. He had seen a flicker of something in Lorenzo's stillness, and he was moving in for the kill. A wager for the Port Elizabeth shipping routes, all of them. The other men at the table shifted, their quiet conversations ceasing. This was more than posturing. This was a play for power. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed fractionally. "I'm listening. Take the most insignificant person in your life, someone who owes you nothing, fears you only by reputation, someone plain, forgettable. Turn her into a woman who would die for you. Not because you command it, but because she adores you." Rico leaned back, spreading his hands. "Make the world believe she is your devoted wife. Do it in 3 months." He paused, letting the sheer audacity of the proposal sink in. "I'm talking about real devotion, Lorenzo. The kind that shines from the eyes. The kind a woman gives a man she loves, not a master she fears. You can't command it. You can't buy it. And I wager the most profitable port on the coast that you, of all men, cannot earn it." Lorenzo's mind flashed back to the salon, to the girl with her head bowed, her presence so slight he had barely registered it. The new maid, Annie, plain, forgettable, invisible. The perfect test subject, the perfect pawn. He thought of Rico's smug, triumphant face if he refused, the whispers that would follow, that Il Silencio had a weakness, that he had backed down from a challenge. It was unthinkable. Pride, cold and hard, was the bedrock of his empire. Slowly, deliberately, Lorenzo Caruso lifted his glass and drained it in one smooth motion. He placed the empty glass on the table with a soft, final click. He met Rico's eager eyes across the smoky expanse, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Outside, the city hummed with life, oblivious. Inside the silent, speeding car carrying him home, Lorenzo stared out at the blur of lights, his reflection a ghost against the glass. The game had begun. And Annie, asleep in her small, stark room in the servants' quarters of his silent kingdom, had no idea she was the prize. The first light of dawn bled through the thin curtains of Annie's room, painting the stark walls in shades of gray and lavender. Sleep had been a shallow, restless thing, a tide that pulled her under only to cast her back onto the shores of a vague and formless anxiety. She rose, the chill of the floorboards seeping through her bare feet, and began the quiet ritual of her morning. She dressed in the simple black and white of her uniform, a second skin that rendered her anonymous, functional. As she braided her long, dark hair, her reflection in the small, cracked mirror was that of a stranger, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that was not her own. Her first task was always the same, tending to the small private conservatory at the back of the mansion. It was the only place in the entire estate that felt alive. Lorenzo Caruso never went there. It had belonged to his mother, they said, a woman spoken of only in hushed whispers. Here, amidst the scent of damp earth and blooming gardenias, Annie could breathe. She moved between the rows of exotic plants, her fingers gently checking the soil, her touch deft and careful as she pruned a withered leaf. This small act of nurturing was a balm to her soul, a quiet rebellion against the cold sterility of the house. It was here she allowed herself to think of Leo, not with the sharp panic of hospital bills, but with the soft warmth of memory. His laughter as they tended to the window box garden in their tiny apartment, his face bright with a simple, uncomplicated joy. A footstep on the gravel path outside made her freeze, her pruning shears held midair. It was Mr. Bianchi, Lorenzo's consigliere. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of carefully guarded secrets, his eyes holding a weary intelligence. Unlike the other men, he had never looked through her. He had always looked at her, with an expression she could never quite decipher. Pity? Curiosity? "Miss Rossi," he said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He stood just inside the doorway, his presence casting a long shadow over the sun-dappled floor. Annie's heart gave a painful lurch. To be addressed by name was a violation of the unspoken rules. It meant she was no longer invisible. "Mr. Bianchi." She curtsied slightly, a gesture of ingrained deference. "Mr. Caruso wishes to see you in his study, now." The words were spoken calmly, but they landed like stones in the quiet conservatory. His study, the heart of the beast, a room spoken of with the same reverence and fear as a king's throne room. No servant was ever summoned there. Ever. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seeped into her bones. Her mind raced, a frantic catalogue of imagined transgressions. Had she broken something? Overheard something she shouldn't have? "Of course," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. She placed her shears in the terracotta pot, her hands trembling so violently she was surprised they made no sound. The walk from the conservatory to the study was the longest of her life. Each step on the polished hallway floor echoed like a drumbeat marking a path to the gallows. Mr. Bianchi walked a pace ahead, his back straight, his silence more unnerving than any threat. He stopped before two massive oak doors and knocked once, a sharp, decisive rap. A low voice from within answered, "Enter." Bianchi opened one of the doors and held it for her, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. In their depths, she saw it then. Pity. It was definitely pity, and that terrified her more than anything. She stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind her, the sound as final as a cell door locking. The study was just as she had imagined, only more so. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a scent of old paper, whiskey, and something else. Something clean and masculine that was uniquely him. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, though the room was not cold. And there, behind a desk the size of a small boat, sat Lorenzo Caruso. He was not looking at her. His attention was on a file spread open before him. The light from a green banker's lamp cast his face in harsh angles and deep shadows, making him look like a portrait of a ruthless Renaissance prince. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Annie stood before his desk, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She could hear the frantic thump of her own pulse in her ears. Finally, without looking up, he spoke. His voice was even lower in this room, a soft, dangerous purr. Anna Rossi, 23 years old, parents deceased, one sibling, a brother, Leonardo Rossi, age 17. He paused. Annie felt the blood drain from her face. How could he know Leo's name? He finally lifted his head, and his eyes, darker and deeper than she had imagined, pinned her in place. They were utterly devoid of emotion, holding the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist studying an insect. He has aplastic anemia, Lorenzo continued, his voice a flat, factual statement. A severe case. The standard treatments have failed. There is an experimental trial, a new immunotherapy protocol, the cost of which is considerable. He gestured to the papers in front of him. Far beyond the means of a maid. Annie couldn't breathe. It felt as if a hand had closed around her throat. He knew everything. This wasn't an accusation. It was a dissection. He had peeled back her life, layer by layer, and laid her most vulnerable secret bare on his polished desk. What do you want?" she stammered, the words tearing from her raw throat. Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning softly. He steepled his fingers, his gaze never leaving her face. "I am a man who appreciates transactions, Miss Rossi. Clean, simple, and mutually beneficial. I have a need. You have a predicament." He pushed the file across the desk towards her. Her eyes fell on the top page. It was a hospital document, stamped with a terrifyingly large sum. Beneath it was a photograph, a recent one, of Leo, looking small and fragile in his hospital bed. A single hot tear escaped her eye and slid down her cheek. She swiped it away with a fierce, angry motion. She would not cry in front of him. She would not give him that. "I am in need of a wife," Lorenzo said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "A temporary arrangement. 3 months. You will live as my wife, you will perform the duties of my wife in public, and you will present to the world a convincing portrait of devotion." Annie stared at him, incomprehension warring with horror. It was a joke, a cruel, sick joke. But the look in his eyes told her he had never been more serious in his life. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why me?" "Because you are perfect," he answered, a flicker of something cold and analytical in his eyes. "You are invisible. No one will question where you came from because they never saw you in the first place. You are a blank canvas upon which I will paint a masterpiece." He leaned forward, the full force of his presence washing over her. "And because you are desperate, desperation ensures compliance." He let the words hang in the air, a poisoned offering. "In return for your performance," he continued smoothly, "I will assume the entirety of Leo's medical costs, the trial, the aftercare, everything. I will ensure he receives the best treatment in the world. I will give him his life back." The room began to spin. The devil's bargain, her soul for her brother's life. She looked at the picture of Leo, his hopeful smile a knife in her heart. She thought of a life without his laugh, without his terrible jokes, without his unwavering belief in her. It was not a life. It was an endless, empty darkness. And then she looked at the man behind the desk, at his cold, merciless eyes, to bind herself to him, to be his possession, his puppet. It was a fate worse than death, but not worse than Leo's death. The fight went out of her in a single crushing wave. Her shoulders slumped. The strength that had held her together for so long crumbled into dust. The choice was never a choice at all. It was an illusion. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. Her own eyes were dry now, filled with a cold, hard resolve. "I accept," she said. The 2 words were the heaviest things she had ever lifted, A death sentence and a salvation, all at once. Lorenzo Caruso gave a slight, satisfied nod, as if closing a simple business deal. He had no idea what those 2 words had cost her. To him, it was just the beginning of a game. For Annie, it was the end of everything. The moment the words "I accept" left her lips, Annie's world bifurcated. There was the life before, a struggle defined by scarcity and fear, but a life that was hers. And then there was the life after, a gilded cage whose bars were forged from her own desperate love. The transition was immediate and brutal. She was escorted from the study not back to the servants' quarters, but up the grand marble staircase she had so diligently polished. Up to the 2nd floor, the domain of the master, a realm she had only ever glimpsed from a distance. Mr. Bianchi led her to a set of double doors at the end of the west wing, a part of the house that was always kept silent and closed. He opened them to reveal not a bedroom, but a suite of rooms that seemed to stretch into an impossible distance. A sitting room furnished with pale silk sofas and delicate spindly-legged tables. A dressing room larger than her entire apartment, lined with empty, waiting wardrobes of cedar and glass. And beyond that, a bedroom dominated by a vast canopied bed that looked as if it could swallow a person whole. "These will be your quarters," Bianchi said, his voice carefully neutral. He gestured to the sitting room. "Mr. Caruso will expect you to be ready in 1 hour. He has arranged for people to assist you." He left her there, standing in the center of the plush Persian rug. The silence in this suite was different from the one downstairs. It was softer, insulated by wealth, but it felt even more suffocating. Annie walked over to the immense window that overlooked the manicured gardens. Below, she could see the small, glass-paned roof of the conservatory. It looked a world away. She felt a pang of loss so sharp it was a physical pain, a grief for the simple, quiet girl who had tended to the gardenias just an hour ago. That girl was gone. In her place stood this thing, a commodity, a fiancé. A knock at the door startled her. Before she could answer, it opened and 2 women entered, followed by a man wheeling in a large rack of clothing swathed in canvas bags. The women were impossibly chic, their movements sharp and efficient. "Miss Rossi," the taller one said, her smile bright, but her eyes clinical. "I am Clara. This is my team. We are here to begin your transformation." The word transformation sent a shiver down Annie's spine. It sounded like something out of a fairy tale, but she knew this was the opposite. This was not magic. This was an erasure. For the next hour, she was a doll to be dressed and prodded. Her simple uniform was removed. Her hair was unbraided, washed, and styled by a man who clucked his tongue at its untamed state. Her calloused hands were scrubbed and moisturized, her nails filed and buffed until they gleamed. She was measured, analyzed, and discussed by Clara and her assistant in hushed professional tones, as if she weren't there at all. "Her bone structure is excellent," Clara murmured, tilting Annie's chin to the light. "Classic. We can work with that. The palette should be muted creams, soft grays, perhaps a deep emerald for effect. Nothing that shouts." "The goal is elegance, not opulence," the other woman agreed. "She must look as if she belongs, not as if she is trying to." Annie stood motionless, her body a battlefield of humiliation and silent fury. She let them peel away the layers of her old self, watching in a strange, detached horror as they constructed a new one. The final result was a woman she barely recognized in the full-length mirror. Dressed in a simple but exquisitely cut cashmere dress the color of oatmeal, her hair swept up in a graceful chignon that exposed the slender line of her neck, she looked polished, refined, a stranger. The only thing that was hers were her eyes, and in them, a fire of rebellion burned, a small secret flame they could not extinguish. When Lorenzo Caruso entered the suite without knocking, the team of stylists immediately melted into the background, their deference absolute. He stood in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe. It was not the look of a man appraising his future bride. It was the look of an investor inspecting a high-value asset. He took in the dress, the hair, the soft leather shoes on her feet. A slow, approving nod. Acceptable, he said. The word was a dismissal. He had purchased a product, and the product had met the specifications. He stepped closer, and Annie had to fight the instinct to flinch away. He stopped just before her, and the scent of him, that clean, sharp scent of wool and cold air, enveloped her. He reached out, not to touch her, but to lift a small velvet box that sat on the dressing table. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a ring. It was not a gaudy diamond. It was a single, flawless sapphire, the color of a midnight sky, set in a delicate platinum band. It was understated, elegant, and impossibly expensive. It was a shackle. "Your left hand," he commanded, his voice low. Annie stared at him, her heart a block of ice in her chest. This was it, the final seal on the bargain. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she raised her hand. It trembled slightly, a single infuriating tremor of weakness. His fingers were cool and firm as he took her hand. He slid the ring onto her fourth finger. It was a perfect fit. The cold weight of it felt alien, a brand marking her as his property. "From this moment on, you are no longer Annie Rossi the maid," he said, his thumb brushing over the sapphire, a gesture that was almost possessive. "You are Annabelle Caruso, my fiancée. You will learn your role, and you will play it to perfection. You will not speak unless spoken to in my presence. You will not offer opinions. Your history is a blank slate that I will write. Do you understand?" She could feel the pulse in his thumb, a steady, powerful beat against her skin. She looked from the ring to his face, into those dark, unreadable eyes, and for the first time, she did not look away. She held his gaze, letting him see the flicker of the unbroken spirit within her. "I understand," she said, her voice clear and cold, "that my brother's life depends on it." A flicker of something surprise? Annoyance? Crossed his features before his mask of indifference snapped back into place. He released her hand as if it had suddenly grown hot. "Good," he said, his tone clipped. "Our first appearance is tonight, a charity gala. It is time for the world to meet my future wife." He turned and walked out, leaving her alone with her new name, her new clothes, and the cold, heavy weight of the sapphire on her finger. She looked down at the ring. A perfect, beautiful prison. The transformation was complete. The ghost of Annie Rossi was gone. In her place stood Annabelle Caruso, a masterpiece painted on a canvas of lies, her heart a silent vow of hatred for the artist who had created her. The charity gala was held in the grand ballroom of the city's oldest and most prestigious hotel. It was a world Annie had only ever read about, a glittering ecosystem of old money and new power. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen tears from the ceiling, casting a fractured golden light over a sea of tuxedos and jewel-toned gowns. The air hummed with the murmur of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses, a symphony of privilege. Annie felt as if she were walking into a lion's den wearing a dress made of lamb chops. The cream-colored silk gown Clara had chosen for her was a masterpiece of understated elegance, clinging to her figure in a way that was both modest and undeniably alluring. A string of simple pearls, cool against her skin, was her only adornment, besides the sapphire ring, which seemed to burn with a cold fire on her finger. But no amount of expensive fabric could quiet the frantic beating of her heart. Lorenzo stood beside her, his hand resting possessively in the small of her back. His touch was light, a mere whisper of pressure, yet it felt like a brand. To the outside world, it was a gesture of intimate affection. To Annie, it was a leash, a constant reminder of who was in control. "Smile," he murmured, his voice a low command meant for her ears alone. "You are the happiest woman in the world." Annie forced her lips into an approximation of a smile. It felt brittle, as if it might crack and shatter at any moment. She let her gaze drift over the crowd, keeping her expression soft, her posture poised, just as she had been coached. Breathe in, breathe out. You are Annabelle Caruso. You belong here. It was another lie in a night built of them. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. A ripple of whispers followed them as they moved through the room, Lorenzo nodding curtly to acquaintances, his expression as unreadable as ever. Annie felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, their gazes a mixture of curiosity, envy, and thinly veiled disdain. She was the unknown variable, the mystery on the arm of the city's most formidable man. Who was she? Where had she come from? The questions were in their eyes, in the tilt of their heads as they watched her. She focused on Lorenzo's back, a solid wall of black wool, and tried to disappear behind the mask of Annabelle. "Lorenzo, my friend." The booming voice belonged to Rico Santoro. He approached them with a wide, predatory grin, his eyes, small and cunning, immediately fixing on Annie. He took her hand, his own fleshy and damp, and brought it to his lips in a gesture of mock chivalry. "And this must be the lovely fiancé," he said, his gaze lingering on the sapphire. "He has been keeping you a secret. I can see why. A treasure like this should be guarded closely." His words were honeyed, but his eyes held the glint of a co-conspirator. This was the man from the wager. Annie felt a chill snake down her spine. This was a test. "Rico," Lorenzo said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. His hand tightened ever so slightly on Annie's back. "A warning. Play your part." "Annabelle, it is a pleasure to finally meet you," she said, her voice a soft, practiced melody. She gently withdrew her hand from Rico's grasp. "Lorenzo has told me so much about his associates." The subtle emphasis on the last word was not lost on Rico. His grin faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected a timid little mouse, not a woman with a spine of steel hidden beneath the silk. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "I'm sure he has. You must tell me, my dear. How does a man like Lorenzo win the heart of a woman like you? He is not known for his romantic pursuits." The question was a baited hook, cast into the still waters between them. Annie felt Lorenzo tense beside her. This was the precipice. One wrong word, one flicker of fear in her eyes, and the whole charade would crumble. She thought of Leo, of his pale face, and his unwavering trust in her. She found her strength there. She turned her gaze to Lorenzo, letting her carefully constructed smile soften into something that looked, to all the world, like genuine adoration. She placed her free hand on his arm, a gesture of ownership. "A man like Lorenzo doesn't need to win a heart," she said, her voice just loud enough for Rico to hear. "He simply has to be himself. Some men offer flowers and poetry. My fiancé offers security. In a world like this," she let her eyes sweep the glittering, dangerous room. What could possibly be more romantic than that? The silence that followed was electric. Rico's face was a mask of stunned disbelief. He had laid a trap, and she had not only sidestepped it, she had turned it back on him with a devastating, irrefutable logic. Lorenzo looked down at her. For the first time, she saw something other than cold calculation in his eyes. It was a flicker of genuine, unwilling surprise. A flicker of respect. He had expected a pawn, but had found a queen. He covered her hand with his own, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. This time, the touch felt different. It was no longer just a leash. It was an acknowledgement. An alliance. "As you can see, Rico," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, triumphant purr, "my fiancé understands the world perfectly." He guided her away, leaving Rico standing amidst the swirl of the party, his bluff called, his wager suddenly looking very, very precarious. As they walked towards the terrace, away from the prying eyes, Lorenzo leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "Well done," he whispered. The words were a simple statement of fact, yet they sent a strange, unwelcome shiver through her. It was the praise of a master for a prized possession, nothing more. But for a fleeting, treacherous moment, it felt like a victory they had shared. And that, Annie realized with a fresh wave of cold dread, was the most dangerous feeling of all. The weeks that followed the gala bled into one another. a disorienting blur of fittings, lessons, and public appearances. Annie's life was no longer her own. It was a carefully curated performance, directed by Lorenzo from the shadows. She learned the names and histories of 100 powerful people, their allegiances and rivalries, a complex, deadly tapestry she was expected to navigate with effortless grace. She learned which fork to use, which wine to compliment, and which topics of conversation to avoid like landmines. She was an exceptional student. Her memory, honed by years of academic study before her life had derailed, absorbed every detail. Her quiet, observant nature allowed her to read the subtle shifts in a room, to understand the unspoken language of power that flowed beneath the surface of polite society. She played the part of Annabelle Caruso so perfectly that, at times, she caught a glimpse of herself in a mirror and felt a jolt of dislocation, a terrifying moment where she couldn't find the real Annie beneath the layers of silk and lies. Lorenzo was a constant, unnerving presence. He was the architect of her new reality, yet he remained a ghost within it. They would share a car to an event, the silence between them thick with unspoken tensions. He would stand beside her at a party, his hand on her back, a silent sentinel guarding his investment. They would return to the cold, quiet mansion and go their separate ways to their separate wings, the length of the marble hallway a silent, uncrossable chasm. He never touched her beyond the necessary public displays of possession. He never spoke to her of anything personal. He watched her, always. His dark, analytical gaze would follow her across a room, assessing, calculating. Annie learned to feel the weight of his stare on her skin. It was not the look of a lover, or even of a man attracted to a woman. It was the look of a master craftsman studying his creation, searching for flaws. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that no amount of expensive food or fine clothing could fill. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. The only contact she had with her old life were the sterile, weekly reports on Leo's condition, delivered to her by Mr. Bianchi in a sealed envelope. The patient is responding well to the initial phase of treatment. Vitals are stable. The clinical words were a lifeline and a torment. They were proof that her sacrifice was working, that Leo was getting better. But they were also a reminder of the chasm that now separated them. She couldn't visit him. Her presence as the newly minted fiancé of Lorenzo Caruso would raise too many questions. So she clutched the reports to her chest in the silent opulence of her suite and wept for the brother she could not see, her tears the only genuine thing left in her life. One rainy afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive silence of her rooms, she found herself drawn to the mansion's library. It was a room she had been avoiding, a place that reminded her too keenly of the person she used to be, a girl who found solace and escape in the pages of books. The library was Lorenzo's domain, a reflection of the man himself. It was vast, silent, and impeccably ordered. The air smelled of aged leather and paper. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, her touch reverent. It felt like coming home. She was so lost in the moment that she didn't hear him enter. "I didn't take you for a reader." His voice, coming from the doorway, made her jump. She spun around, her hand flying to her chest, her heart hammering. He stood there watching her, his expression unreadable. He had shed his suit jacket, and his white shirt was open at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. It was the most casual she had ever seen him, and somehow, it made him look even more dangerous. I used to," she stammered, feeling like a trespasser caught in the act. "Before." He walked into the room, his movements fluid and silent. He stopped at a globe in the corner, giving it a slow spin with one finger. "Before what?" "Before my life became this," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. It was the first honest thing she had said to him since the day in his study. He stopped the globe's rotation, his gaze lifting to meet hers across the room. "You are living a life most women would kill for." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Most women don't know the price." He said nothing, simply watched her. The silence in the room stretched, but this time it felt different. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of her words, with the sudden, shocking crack in the facade of their arrangement. "What did you used to read?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The unexpected question threw her off balance. "History," she answered automatically, "and poetry." He raised a single dark eyebrow. "An unusual combination." "History tells us what people did," she said, her voice gaining a little of its old strength. "Poetry tells us what they felt. I think you need both to understand anything." He walked over to a shelf, his back to her. He pulled out a slim, leather-bound volume and turned, holding it out to her. His eyes held a strange, challenging light. "Keats," he said. Annie stared at the book, then at him. John Keats, her favorite. The poet of beauty and sorrow, of love and loss. How could he possibly know? It had to be a coincidence, a cruel, random twist of fate. She reached out and took the book. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. It was the first time they had touched skin to skin. His was cool, smooth, and shockingly real. She snatched her hand back as if burned, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. He saw it. He saw the shock in her eyes, the way her breath hitched. For a fraction of a second, his mask slipped. She saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded in his gaze, a flash of surprise that mirrored her own. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, shuttered away behind his usual cold control. "The reports on your brother are favorable," he said, his voice once again flat and businesslike, the moment of connection severed. "The doctors are optimistic. You are holding up your end of the bargain. I am holding up mine." He turned and left the library, leaving her standing in the silence, the book of poetry clutched in her hands. Her heart was a wild, frantic thing in her chest. She had come in here seeking a memory of the girl she used to be. But for one terrifying, breathtaking moment, she had not been looking at the past. She had been looking at the man who was her present, her jailer, her savior, and she had felt something other than hatred. She sank into one of the leather armchairs, her legs suddenly weak. She opened the book. The pages were worn, the corners soft with use. It was not a decorative volume. It was a book that had been read, and read often. Annie closed her eyes, the scent of old paper and leather filling her senses. The world she thought she understood had just tilted on its axis. Lorenzo Caruso, Il Silenzio, the monster who had bought her life, read Keats. And that single, impossible fact was more dangerous than any threat he had ever made. The encounter in the library left a hairline crack in the frozen surface of their relationship. It was a tiny fracture, almost invisible, but through it, something new and unsettling began to seep. The silence between them was no longer just an absence of words. It was now charged with the memory of that shared moment, of that unexpected jolt of connection. Annie found herself watching him. From behind the mask of the demure Annabelle, she studied him. She noticed the small things, the way his fingers, long and elegant, would trace the rim of his whiskey glass when he was deep in thought, the faint, vertical line that would appear between his eyebrows when he read a document that displeased him, the way he would sometimes stare into the fire, his expression so unguardedly bleak it made her chest ache with a strange, unwelcome empathy. She was playing with fire, and she knew it. Every observation, every flicker of curiosity, was a step deeper into his world, a step further away from the simple, righteous hatred that had been her armor. Hating him was safe. Understanding him was a peril she could not afford. The wager, she realized, was more insidious than she had first thought. It wasn't just about transforming her into a beautiful, polished woman. It was about eroding the boundaries between them, forcing an intimacy that was far more dangerous than any physical threat. They were two people living a lie so profound that, inevitably, pieces of the truth began to bleed through. Lorenzo, too, had changed. He was no less controlling, no less formidable, but the nature of his observation had shifted. He no longer looked at her as a mere creation. He looked at her as a puzzle he couldn't solve. He would catch her reading in the garden, a book of history open on her lap, and he would pause, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. He began to seek her out, using the thinnest of pretexts. One evening, he found her in the music room, a vast, dust-sheeted chamber that was never used. She was sitting at the grand piano, her fingers hovering over the yellowed ivory keys, though she did not play. "I didn't know you played," he said from the doorway. He seemed to have a penchant for appearing out of nowhere, a ghost in his own home. Annie pulled her hands back as if the keys were hot. "I don't. Not really. My mother taught me a little, a long time ago." He walked over to the piano, his presence instantly shrinking the cavernous room. He ran a finger over the lid, leaving a clean streak in the fine layer of dust. "My mother used to play. This was her room." It was the first time he had ever mentioned his mother. The hushed whispers of the staff had painted a picture of a sad, beautiful woman who had faded away within the cold walls of the mansion. "She would have liked you," he said. The words so quiet, so unexpected, they were almost a physical shock. He was not looking at her, but at the sheet music still open on the stand, a faded, difficult piece by Chopin. She appreciated quiet strength. Annie's throat felt tight. She didn't know the woman in this story, the man who spoke of his mother with a flicker of old pain in his eyes. This man was not Il Silencio. He was someone else entirely. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, the words formal but sincere. He looked at her then, and his gaze was heavy with a decade of unspoken grief. "So am I." He turned and left without another word. Annie remained seated at the piano, her heart a tangled knot of confusion. She was the prisoner. He was the jailer. It was a simple, stark dynamic. But the lines were beginning to blur. He was showing her pieces of himself, small, fragmented glimpses of the man behind the monster, and a terrifying, treacherous part of her wanted to see more. The true test came a week later. It was the second month of their arrangement, and Rico Santoro, ever the serpent, had invited them to a weekend at his sprawling country estate. It was a summons they could not refuse. The estate was a gaudy monument to new money, a place of loud parties and even louder people. It was the antithesis of Lorenzo's cold, controlled world, and Annie felt his tension like a coiled spring beside her during the long drive. The weekend was an ordeal. Rico and his circle treated Annie with a cloying, condescending familiarity. They called her Little Dove and complimented her beauty in a way that was meant to be a direct compliment to Lorenzo's good taste, as if she were a new car he had acquired. Through it all, she maintained her serene, untouchable composure, the perfect Donna Caruso. On the second night, after a long dinner filled with forced laughter and veiled insults, Annie was walking along a dimly lit colonnade, seeking a moment of fresh air, when a man stepped out from the shadows. He was one of Rico's inner circle, a brute named Frankie with a leering smile and hands like slabs of meat. "All alone, little dove?" he slurred, the smell of whiskey thick on his breath. "The big boss leave you unguarded?" Annie's blood ran cold. She took a step back, but he mirrored her movement, blocking her path. "I was just returning to my room." "What's the hurry?" He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "Rico says you're just a hired girl playing a part. Says the whole thing's a sham. Why don't you and I have some real fun?" Panic, sharp and blinding, clawed at her throat. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me." His smile widened. "I don't think so. I believe the lady asked you to let go." The voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it sliced through the night air like a shard of ice. Both Annie and Frankie froze. Lorenzo emerged from the shadows at the end of the colonnade. He was not hurrying. He was strolling towards them, his hands in his pockets, but every ounce of his lethal stillness was focused on the hand gripping Annie's arm. The air around him seemed to crackle with a violence so profound it was almost visible. Frankie's face paled. He immediately released Annie, taking a clumsy step back. "Boss Caruso, we were just talking." Lorenzo did not look at Frankie. His eyes were fixed on the red marks forming on Annie's pale skin. When he finally lifted his gaze to Frankie's face, it was a look of such pure, cold rage that Annie felt her breath catch in her throat. This was Il Silencio. This was the predator she had only glimpsed. "You put your hands on what is mine," Lorenzo said, his voice a deadly soft whisper. "There are consequences for such mistakes." He took a step forward. Frankie, sweating now, held up his hands. "No disrespect, boss. I swear, I was drunk. I didn't mean anything." Lorenzo stopped directly in front of him. He was shorter than the big man, but in that moment, he towered over him. He did not raise his voice. He did not move a muscle. He simply held Frankie's gaze, and Frankie broke. A tremor started in the big man's hands and spread through his body. He couldn't hold Lorenzo's stare. His eyes darted away, filled with a primal, abject terror. "Get out of my sight," Lorenzo whispered, "and pray I forget your face by morning." Frankie scrambled away, practically tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape. The colonnade was silent again, save for the chirping of crickets. Annie stood frozen, her arm throbbing, her body trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. Lorenzo turned to her. His face was still a hard, unforgiving mask of fury. He reached out, his movement stiff, and gently took her arm, his fingers tracing the red imprints of Frankie's hand. His touch was surprisingly tender. "Did he hurt you?" he asked, his voice rough. Annie shook her head, unable to speak. The care in his touch, the protective rage in his eyes. It was all part of the act, she told herself. She was his possession. Frankie had damaged his property. That's all it was. A matter of pride. But when his eyes met hers, she saw more than just wounded pride. She saw a flicker of genuine, raw fury, an anger that was personal. He had not been defending his investment. He had been defending her. He led her back towards their suite without a word. Just before they reached the door, he stopped. "He will not touch you again," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. "No one will." He opened the door for her and she slipped inside, her heart a wild, confused drum against her ribs. She leaned against the cool wood of the door, listening to his footsteps retreat down the hall. The line had been crossed. Tonight, he had not been her jailer. He had been her protector. And the cold, simple hatred she had clung to for so long was beginning to feel like a lie. She looked down at her arm, at the faint red marks, and for the first time, she wondered what it would feel like if Lorenzo Caruso's touch was not one of possession, but of passion. The thought was so terrifying, so utterly forbidden, that she pushed it away with all her might. But it was too late. It had been planted. A tiny, dangerous seed in the barren wasteland of her heart. The incident with Frankie at Rico's estate became another unspoken secret between them, a charged memory that altered the very air they breathed. The journey back to the city was steeped in a thick, unnavigable silence. Lorenzo drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw a hard, unrelenting line. Annie sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the passing landscape, her mind a maelstrom. The image of his face, contorted in that cold, protective fury, was seared behind her eyelids. He was defending his property. She repeated the phrase to herself, a desperate mantra to quell the treacherous warmth unfurling in her chest. It was about pride, about the wager. Nothing more. But the lie was wearing thin, its edges frayed by the memory of his gentle touch on her bruised arm, the solemn vow in his voice. Back in the cold sanctuary of the mansion, the distance between them felt both greater and smaller than ever before. They retreated to their separate wings, but the hallway no longer felt like a chasm. It felt like a tightly stretched wire, humming with a tension that was new and terrifyingly intimate. Lorenzo's control, usually so absolute, began to show cracks. Annie would catch him watching her with an intensity that went beyond mere assessment. There was a darkness in his eyes now, a turbulent, brooding quality that made her skin prickle. He was a man at war with himself, and she was, inexplicably, the battlefield. He began to break his own rules. One evening, he appeared at the door of her suite. He didn't knock, but he hesitated in the doorway, a rare moment of uncertainty for a man who moved through the world as if he owned it. He held a crystal glass filled with an amber liquid. "You look unwell," he stated, his voice flat. It was his version of expressing concern. Annie was sitting by the window, the weekly report on Leo clutched in her hand. The news was good. Significant improvement in bone marrow function. But the sterile words only amplified her sense of isolation. She hadn't realized she had been crying until she lifted a hand to her face and felt the dampness on her cheek. "I'm fine," she said, quickly folding the paper and tucking it away. He walked into the room, his presence immediately dominating the delicate feminine space. He handed her the glass. "Drink it. It's brandy." She took it, her fingers brushing his. The now familiar jolt of electricity passed between them, and this time, neither of them pulled away immediately. His gaze dropped to her lips, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he was going to kiss her. The air grew thick, heavy with the unspoken possibility. Then he stepped back, severing the connection. "My father used to say it was a cure for melancholy," he said, his voice rough. "He was usually wrong, but it's worth a try." Annie took a sip. The brandy was fire in her throat, a welcome, searing heat that chased away some of the chill in her heart. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, and watched her. "The wager," she said, her voice raspy from the alcohol and unshed tears. Are you winning?" The question was a risk, a deliberate prodding at the cold, hard reality of their situation. She needed to remind herself of it, to shore up her crumbling defenses. His expression tightened. "Rico is convinced. He believes you are the picture of a devoted wife." "And am I?" she asked, her eyes challenging him over the rim of her glass. "Am I playing my part well enough for you, Lorenzo?" Using his first name felt like a small, sharp rebellion. He didn't answer for a long moment. He stared into the empty hearth as if seeing ghosts in the cold ashes. "You play it too well," he said finally, his voice so low she barely heard him. He turned and left her then, leaving his words to hang in the silent room, as potent and intoxicating as the brandy she held in her hand. "You play it too well." It was not a compliment. It was a confession. A confession that the lines were blurring for him, too. That the actress was becoming indistinguishable from the role, and the master of the game was beginning to believe his own beautiful, dangerous lie. The final month of the wager began. A silent countdown to a freedom Annie was no longer sure she wanted. The thought terrified her. This place, this man, they were seeping into her, changing the very fiber of her being. She was forgetting the girl who loved poetry and tended to gardenias. In her place was a woman who knew the weight of a Don's gaze and the subtle taste of fear and power. The endgame arrived in the form of an invitation. A weekend on Lorenzo's private yacht for a select few couples. Rico Santoro and his wife were the guests of honor. It was the final, crucial performance, designed to be the checkmate in Lorenzo's game. An intimate setting, far from the prying eyes of the city, where any cracks in their facade would be impossible to hide. The yacht, named Serenity, was anything but. It was a floating palace of teak and chrome, a testament to Lorenzo's immense wealth and power. As they sailed out into the deep azure water, the city skyline shrinking behind them, Annie felt a profound sense of being untethered. There were no escapes here. They were adrift, locked in this final act together. The first day was a tense performance of leisurely relaxation. Rico watched them like a hawk, his eyes missing nothing. The way Annie instinctively refilled Lorenzo's coffee, the proprietary way Lorenzo's hand rested on her chair, the easy, familiar silences that fell between them. That night, after another strained dinner, Annie stood on the deserted aft deck, the sea breeze cool against her skin. The moon laid a shivering silver path across the black water. It was beautiful and achingly lonely. She heard a footstep behind her and knew it was him. He came to stand beside her at the railing, not speaking for a long time. They stared out at the endless dark horizon. "After this weekend it will be over," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be part of the ocean's hum. "The wager will be won. You will be free." Annie's hands tightened on the cool metal railing. Freedom. It was what she had prayed for, what she had sold her soul for. So why did the words sound like a death sentence? "And Leo?" she asked, her voice small. "I will honor my agreement. His care will be provided for as long as he needs it. You will have a new identity, a new life, far from here. You will be safe." She turned to look at him. His face was cast in moonlight and shadow, a study in stark contrasts. She could see the fatigue in his eyes, the immense weight he carried. "And you?" she asked, the question slipping out, unbidden. "What happens to you after I'm gone?" His gaze locked with hers. The air between them crackled, charged with 3 months of unspoken words, of shared secrets and forbidden feelings. The roar of the ocean seemed to fade into a dull hum, the world shrinking to the space between their two bodies. "I will go back to the silence," he said, his voice raw with a vulnerability she had never heard before. And then he moved. It was not a calculated act. It was an impulse, a surrender. He closed the small distance between them, one hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her cheek. His eyes searched hers, filled with a question he didn't seem to know how to ask. "Annie," he whispered, her real name a prayer on his lips. Her own name, the one she thought she had lost, was the thing that broke her. A soft, wounded sound escaped her throat. She leaned into his touch, a moth drawn to a devastating flame. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was 3 months of tension and denial and forbidden curiosity unleashed in a single, shattering moment. It was harsh and hungry, a collision of 2 worlds. She tasted the whiskey on his lips and the salt from the sea air, a flavor of danger and sorrow. Her hands came up to grip his shirt, holding on as if she were drowning. He drew her closer, and for a heartbeat the world fell away. Nothing existed but the rhythm of 2 souls colliding. The kiss deepened into silence, not hunger, a surrender neither of them understood. He was the first to pull back, tearing his mouth from hers with a ragged gasp. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing harsh, his eyes closed. The silence that fell was no longer empty or tense. It was alive, thrumming with the catastrophic, beautiful, impossible thing that had just happened between them. The wager was forgotten. The lies were burned away in the heat of that kiss. All that was left was the terrifying, undeniable truth, and neither of them knew what to do with it. The aftermath of the kiss was a deafening silence. They stood on the deck, locked in a fragile truce, the moon their only witness. The world had irrevocably shifted, and the carefully constructed walls between them had been reduced to rubble. Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes dark with a turmoil that mirrored her own. He looked like a man who had just set fire to his own kingdom and was watching, mesmerized, as it burned. Without a word, he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and led her back inside. His touch was no longer a performance or a brand of ownership. It was a tether, a desperate anchor in the storm they had just unleashed. The next day, the final day of the weekend, was an exercise in exquisite torture. They had to continue the performance for Rico, but now the act was poisoned by the truth. Every polite smile, every shared glance, every casual touch was electric. Annie felt as if she were made of glass, terrified that Rico would see straight through her to the wild, chaotic beating of her heart. Lorenzo was a master of control. To the outside world, he was the same cool, commanding, attentive to his fiancée. But Annie could see the difference. She could feel the tension humming just beneath his skin, see the way his eyes would find hers across the room, a silent, searching question in their depths. Rico, it seemed, saw only what he wanted to see. He saw the easy intimacy, the undeniable chemistry. He saw a woman who looked at Lorenzo not with fear, but with a complex, captivating emotion he mistook for simple adoration. As the yacht docked back in the city under a sky the color of bruises, Rico clapped Lorenzo on the shoulder, his expression a mixture of grudging admiration and genuine defeat. "You win, Lorenzo," he said, his voice a low grumble. "The port routes are yours. I don't know how you did it, you cold-hearted bastard, but the girl..." The girl is genuinely in love with you." The words, meant as a concession, landed like a physical blow. Annie, standing a few feet away, felt the blood drain from her face. "In love with you." The phrase hung in the air, a devastating public declaration of the secret she had not even dared to admit to herself. She saw Lorenzo flinch. It was a minuscule reaction, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, but she saw it. The wager, the cold, ugly reason for their entire world, had just reared its head again, reminding them that the foundation of whatever they had built was made of lies. "A deal is a deal," Lorenzo said, his voice hard. After Rico and the others had departed, leaving them alone on the pier, the silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than ever before. The fragile connection forged on the deck of the yacht had been shattered by Rico's crude summary of their sham. They drove back to the mansion without speaking. The city lights blurred past the window, a river of indifferent stars. When they arrived, Annie got out of the car and walked towards the entrance, her body numb. "Annie?" His voice stopped her on the grandstone steps. She turned. He stood by the car, the harsh light of the entryway casting his face in shadow. "The arrangement is over," he said, his voice a flat, hollow sound. "You are free. Bianchi will make the arrangements for your new life in the morning. A new name, a new city. Everything I promised." She stared at him, her heart splintering. It was what she was supposed to want. Freedom. Safety for Leo. A life away from this world of shadows. But the thought of walking away, of never seeing him again, was an agony she had not anticipated. The cage had become, in some strange, twisted way, a sanctuary. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. He took a step towards her, his face a mask of conflict. "Wanting," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name, "is a luxury I have never been afforded. This is what is necessary. For your safety." "My safety?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "From whom? From Frankie? You dealt with him. From Rico? You've won. Who am I in danger from, Lorenzo?" He was silent, but his eyes gave him away. The darkness, the turmoil. She saw it then, with a horrifying, soul-crushing clarity. "From you," she whispered, the realization a punch to the gut. "This is about protecting me from you." He didn't deny it. He couldn't. He was Il Silencio, a man who lived by a code of ruthless control. And she, Annie, was the one thing in his perfectly ordered world that he could not control. The feelings she evoked in him were a liability, a weakness, a danger to them both. To keep her safe, he had to cut her out of his life like a surgeon removing a cancer. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. Tears of anger, of betrayal, of a heartbreak so profound it felt like a physical wound. "So that's it?" she said, her voice rising. 3 months of my life, playing a part, and it all ends with a business transaction? You pay your bill, and I disappear? "It was always a transaction, Annie," he said, his voice hard, a desperate attempt to rebuild the walls between them. "Was it?" She shot back, taking a step down towards him. "Was it a transaction in the library? Was it a transaction when you told me about your mother? Was it a transaction on the yacht?" She was standing in front of him now, close enough to see the muscle jumping in his clenched jaw. She lifted a trembling hand and laid it flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. "Tell me it meant nothing, Lorenzo," she whispered, her eyes pleading with his. "Look at me and tell me that kiss was just a part of the game. Lie to me one more time." He looked down at her hand on his chest, then back to her face. His own was a portrait of anguish. The mask of Il Silencio was gone. In its place was a man being torn apart. He opened his mouth to speak, to say the cruel, necessary words that would sever them for good. But he couldn't. Instead, he did the one thing that would shatter them both. He covered her hand with his grip desperate, and leaned in until his forehead rested against hers. "I can't," he breathed, the words a raw, broken confession. "I can't lie to you anymore." The admission was a complete and utter surrender. He was not letting her go to win a game or to maintain control. He was letting her go because he cared for her. And in his dark, violent world, caring for someone was the most dangerous move of all. It painted a target on their back. He squeezed her hand one last time, a final, agonizing goodbye. Then he released her, stepped back, and turned, walking away from her and back into the shadows of his silent mansion, leaving her alone on the steps with the ruins of their beautiful, impossible lie. Annie did not sleep. She sat in the opulent silence of her suite, a ghost amidst the fine silks and polished woods. The freedom she had been promised felt like a death row pardon that had arrived moments too late. Her heart, a thing she had guarded so fiercely, had been stolen, and the thief had just exiled her from his kingdom. The morning arrived, pale and gray, a mirror of the ashes in her soul. A soft knock came at the door. It was Mr. Bianchi, his face etched with a weary kindness. He held a thick leather portfolio. "Miss Rossi," he began, his voice gentle. "That's not my name anymore, is it?" Annie said, her own voice hollow, devoid of emotion. "He gave me a new one. What is it today? Jane Doe?" Bianchi's expression was pained. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "He is doing this to protect you, Annabelle." Using the name he had known her by for months was a quiet act of compassion. "He is a coward," she replied, the words sharp with grief. "He is hiding behind his reputation because he's afraid of feeling something real. He is afraid of what his world will do to something real," Bianchi corrected softly. He placed the portfolio on the table. "Everything is in here. A passport, a driver's license, birth certificate, all in the name of Amelia Davis. A bank account with a substantial sum has been opened for you. There are keys to an apartment in a quiet city on the West Coast. There is a letter of recommendation for a position at a university library there. It is a complete life, clean and untraceable." He slid the portfolio across the table. "A car will be waiting in 1 hour to take you to a private airfield." Annie stared at the leather folder. Amelia Davis. It sounded like the name of a stranger, a woman who read books and lived by the sea, a woman who had never known the cold weight of a Don's gaze or the devastating heat of his kiss. It was a life of peace, a life of emptiness. "What about Leo?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Mr. Caruso has established an irrevocable trust for his medical care. It is managed by a third party and is completely anonymous. You will receive regular encrypted updates. Your brother will be safe for the rest of his life. That was his promise." The thoroughness of it all was a testament to Lorenzo's power, and in a strange way, to the depth of his feelings. He wasn't just casting her aside. He was building her a fortress of safety 1,000 miles away. He was surgically removing her from his life to save her from the disease of being loved by him. "I won't see him again," she stated, the words a flat line of acceptance. It wasn't a question. "No," Bianchi confirmed, his voice heavy with regret. "It is better this way." After he left, Annie walked through the suite, her hand trailing over the objects that had defined her gilded captivity. The cashmere dress she had first worn, the volume of Keats, still on her nightstand. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. She opened it to a random page. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." She snapped the book shut, a dry, ragged sob escaping her lips. An hour later, dressed in simple, unremarkable clothes that felt alien on her skin, she walked down the grand marble staircase for the last time. The mansion was silent, holding its breath. Every step was an echo of her first day. But the girl who had polished this marble was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew the impossible weight of love and loss. As she reached the bottom, she saw him. He was standing in the shadows of the grand salon, the same spot where she had first felt the chill of his presence. He had not slept. His face was stark and drawn, his eyes holding the haunted look of a man who had been to war with his own soul and lost. She stopped, her hand gripping the handle of her small suitcase. This was the final, silent goodbye. The air between them was a taut, vibrating wire of everything left unsaid. "Don't go. I love you," Stay with me. Forgive me. The words screamed in the silence, but neither of them gave them voice. To speak them would be to condemn them both. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a dismissal, a release, an act of supreme, agonizing sacrifice. Annie held his gaze for a moment longer, memorizing the harsh, beautiful lines of his face. Then she turned, and without looking back, she walked out of the silent mansion, out of the life of Annabelle Caruso, and into the lonely, gray morning. Meanwhile, in a darkened office across town, Rico Santoro swirled the amber liquid in his glass, a smug smile on his face. The loss of the port roots stung, but he was a man who played the long game. The door opened, and one of his men entered. "It's done," the man said. "The girl is gone. Caruso put her on a private plane an hour ago." Rico's smile widened. "Excellent. And the other matter?" "Our source inside the hospital confirms it. The brother is responding well. He's weak, but he's getting stronger every day." "Good." Rico took a sip of his drink. "Lorenzo thinks he's so clever. He thinks this was about pride, about a wager. He has no idea." The henchman looked confused. "Boss, I don't understand. He won. You lost the port." "The port was bait," Rico said, his eyes gleaming with a cunning cruelty. "You don't attack a fortress like Caruso by hitting the walls. You find the one, tiny, unguarded window, and you wait." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "All these months, I wasn't watching him. I was watching her, the maid, the nobody. And I saw what he could never see in himself. She isn't his weakness. She's his humanity. And now that he has known it, he will be an empty shell without it." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city that Lorenzo now controlled. He sent her away to protect her. Rico mused, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. But he's the one who is truly in danger now. A king without a heart is a king who can be toppled. Let him have his victory. Let him sit alone in his silent castle. Our war isn't over. It's just begun. He raised his glass in a mock toast to the distant, invisible fortress of his rival. "Checkmate is coming, Lorenzo," he whispered to the city, "and you'll never see it coming." 6 months passed. 6 months of a quiet, hollow existence. Annie, or Amelia Davis, as the world now knew her, lived in a small, sun-drenched apartment overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The air smelled of salt and jasmine, a world away from the scent of lemon oil and old secrets. She worked at the university library, a silent custodian of other people's stories, her own locked away in a part of her heart she never visited. She received the encrypted updates on Leo every Friday. He was in remission. He was gaining weight. He had started a course in graphic design at a local college. He was living. The joy she should have felt was a pale, watery thing, diluted by the constant, grinding ache of her own solitude. Her sacrifice had worked. She had won her brother's life. She had lost her own. She never spoke of Lorenzo. She never allowed herself to even think his name. But he was there, in the silence between the turning of pages, in the lonely expanse of her bed at night, in the sudden, sharp clenching of her heart, when she saw a man in a dark, well-tailored suit. He was a ghost who had followed her across the country, a phantom limb she still reached for in the dark. One rainy Tuesday, a package arrived at her door. It was a small, unassuming brown box with no return address. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was the slim, leather-bound volume of Keats from Lorenzo's library. There was no note. There didn't need to be. She sank to the floor, the book clutched to her chest, and for the first time in 6 months, she allowed herself to grieve. Sobs racked her body, a storm of pent-up sorrow and impossible love. The book was a message, a memory, a confession that he had not forgotten. It was a sign that her ghost haunted him too. It was the cruelest, most beautiful gift he could have possibly sent. In the silent, cold mansion in the heart of the city, Lorenzo Caruso was a king presiding over an empire of shadows. He had won the wager. He had consolidated his power. Rico Santoro, strangely, had been quiet. retreating after his loss. Lorenzo's enemies feared him more than ever. His control was absolute. And he was utterly, completely empty. The mansion, once a symbol of his power, was now just a collection of empty rooms. The silence, once his weapon, was now his tormentor. It echoed with the memory of her soft footfalls, her quiet laughter, the way she had looked at him in the library. He saw her everywhere. Every sunrise that bled through the windows of her old suite, every note of a Chopin piece he heard on the radio, every bloom in his mother's conservatory. His carefully ordered world had become a prison of memory. He had sent her away to protect her, but in doing so, he had gutted his own soul. Rico had been right. She was his humanity, and he had willingly amputated it. He was stronger, more ruthless, more feared than ever, and he had never been weaker. One night, Mr. Bianchi found him in the study, staring at a single photograph on his desk. It wasn't a picture of Annie. It was an old, faded photo of his parents. "You are going to destroy yourself," Bianchi said, his voice raw with a concern he rarely showed. Lorenzo didn't look up. "It is what I deserve." "This isn't about what you deserve," Bianchi countered, his voice rising with a rare passion. "This is about what you have become. Your father ruled with fear. For a time, you were learning to rule with strength and something more. With honor. The honor she saw in you." He stepped closer to the desk. "But now, you are reverting. You are becoming him. The silence is consuming you." Bianchi placed a thin file on the desk. "Rico Santoro has not been quiet. He has been patient. He has been making moves, forging alliances with your rivals while you have been locked in this purgatory. He is planning to strike. He thinks you are weak. He thinks you have lost your heart for the fight." Lorenzo finally looked up, his eyes black holes of exhaustion and despair. "He is right." "No," Bianchi said firmly. "He is wrong. You haven't lost it. You sent it away. There is a difference." He tapped the file. "This is Rico's plan. A move against your shipping interests, the very ones you won from him. It's an act of war. You must answer it. For the sake of this family, for the sake of your name, and for her. Do you think the life you built for her will remain safe if you fall?" The question hung in the air, a final desperate gambit. Bianchi had found the one nerve that was still alive, her safety, the one thing that mattered more than his own damnation. A flicker of the old fire returned to Lorenzo's eyes, the cold, lethal focus of Il Silencio. He had sent her away to keep her safe. If his fall meant that safety was compromised, then he would not fall. He would not allow the world he had protected her from to ever touch her again. He opened the file. His expression hardened, the lines of the strategist, the king, returning to his face. "Summon the capos," he said, his voice a low, dangerous command. "The silence is over." Weeks later, Annie sat in a small cafe near her apartment, the book of Keats on the table beside her. It had become her constant companion. She was reading a news article on her tablet, a small, buried item from the business section about a hostile takeover in the shipping industry on the East Coast. A powerful syndicate, led by a man named Lorenzo Caruso, had ruthlessly crushed a rival organization led by Rico Santoro. The article spoke of a brilliant, silent war, fought in boardrooms and on shipping docks, ending in a total, crushing victory for Caruso. She read the words, and a slow, tremulous smile touched her lips. He was not just surviving. He was fighting. The king had not abdicated his throne. As she looked up, her gaze fell upon a man standing across the street, half hidden in the shade of a jacaranda tree. He was older, with a kind, weary face that was achingly familiar. Mr. Bianchi. He was not looking at her. He was simply standing there, a silent guardian watching from a distance. He was her invisible protector, a sign that Lorenzo's vow to keep her safe was still in effect. He was the warden of her beautiful, lonely prison. He met her eyes across the traffic-filled street. A long, silent moment passed between them. It was a question and an answer. "Are you well?" His eyes asked. "I am alive," hers answered. He gave a slight formal nod, the kind a loyal soldier gives to a queen in exile. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Annie was left with the book, the news article, and the faint, lingering warmth of being watched over. She looked down at the volume of poetry in her hands, then back at the empty space where Bianchi had stood. Her life was not over. It was a story paused in the middle. The ending had not yet been written. She had been sent away for her safety, and he had stayed behind to fight the dragons that guarded their cage. Perhaps one day, when the wars were over and the world was safe, a man who had gone back to the silence would come looking for the woman who had taught him what it meant to have a heart. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 6 months, she felt not the ache of loss, but the first, faint, fluttering pulse of hope. It was a quiet, fragile thing, but like her, it was a survivor. And in a world of silence and shadows, sometimes, hope was the only weapon you needed.